So your second reading for Unit 2 will be pages 162 to 163, and we'll be covering net migration, the demographic equation, total fertility rate, replacement rate, and the dependency ratio. So when we calculate the net migration, we're looking at the total number of people who are entering and leaving a country. So just like if you're familiar with, paychecks after taxes, your net pay is a little bit lower. So when we look at net migration, we have to look at the number of immigrants minus the number of emigrants, and we divide that by the total population divided by 1,000. So you're really ending up getting a number that will be comparable, that will be workable with the crude birth rate and crude death rate. So you want to make sure that you're doing that population divided by 1,000. So you're using really like the same units, like how in math you want to match your units up, right? So when we're doing this, immigration minus emigration divided by population divided by 1,000. And immigration is the number of individuals who are migrating into a country. See how the I is there? Immigration, people coming in. And emigration is the number of individuals that are exiting or leaving a country. We use the NMR, the net migration rate, to calculate the demographic equation. So this accounts for migration when we look at population growth or population decline. So yesterday you were just looking at the total population or the natural population growth with just birth and death, and now we're going to account for immigration and emigration. And so you take that crude birth rate minus the crude death rate, and you add to it the net migration rate, and then you divide that number by 10, and that'll give you population growth expressed as a percentage. So why do you have to divide it by 10? Because when we're looking at the regular population growth rate, or R, it's a percent. And crude birth rate, crude death rate, and net migration rate are all calculated by per 1,000. And so if you're going to go from per 1,000 to percent or per 100, we have to divide by 10 to make sure that, again, we are working with the same units. So to go from per 1,000 to per 100, you just divide by 10. And this will give you that population growth rate, that R, that you use in that doubling time formula. So 70 divided by R. So this will tell you how fast the population is doubling. If you have a negative net migration rate, it just means that more people are leaving the country than moving into the country. And this could indicate a couple of different things, but a lot of times it indicates a country where it is industrializing and the population has been growing quickly, and now people are leaving to work in other places. So when we look at why global population is increasing, we have to look at a couple measurements. So one of them is the total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is a measurement used by geographers to look at how many births are taking place in a society. It's defined as the average number of children that a woman will have through her childbearing years, which are estimated ages 15 to, your Rubenstein textbook says 49, your review book says 45, so there's some variance, but basically from 15 to about 45 to 50, when women stop having children. The total fertility rate for the world is 2.5, but it's different in different regions. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 5 or more, and it's 2 or less in almost all European countries. We also have to look at some mortality rates. So one of the mortality rates we look at is infant mortality rate. This lets geographers understand death rates in a society. And infant mortality rate is defined as the annual number of deaths of infants under 1 year of age. And you're comparing this with total live births. And it's usually expressed per 1,000 rather than as a percentage, like most of the population stats are. And the infant mortality rate is about 5 per 1,000 in most developed countries, and it's close to 80 per 1,000 in most sub-Saharan African countries. The highest infant mortality rate in the world right now is in Afghanistan. Your book has a formula for you. The formula to calculate total fertility rate is the number of children born divided by the women who are aged 15 to 25. And we also need to talk about like what replacement fertility rate is. So the replacement rate in most places is about 2.1. 2.1 means if every couple, every two people, if you have 2.1 kids, you would keep the population exactly the same. No one's having zero point 0.1 of a child, though, right? It's just the average because even when you have a country with a low infant mortality rate, children still die, infants still die. So 2.1 means that you're replacing every person on this planet, and the population's not going to grow at all. So the closer the replacement, the total fertility rate is at 2.1, the closer you are to just replacing it. However, if you have a replacement you might have a replacement rate that's higher in a country that has higher infant mortality or has, higher rates of disease, higher rates of child death. So if you predict that more infants and children will die, then you might need to have a replacement rate that's higher than 2.1 to replace your cells in the population. And there's some global patterns you can look at. If you look here, you can see the crude birth rate per 1,000 in the population. You can see the places in the world where that crude birth rate is particularly high. So some countries here in the Middle East, so Afghanistan, sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of East Africa. And you can see here, this is where women are having the most children, which obviously matches the crude birth rate, because if women aren't having a lot of kids, you wouldn't have a high crude birth rate. And those areas tend to have a higher infant mortality rate as well. When you have a high infant mortality rate, you can use that as a barometer to see how women are treated in the country. And so in countries where women have access to education and access to healthcare, infant mortality rates tend to be lower. So it's no surprise that Afghanistan would have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. If you need to reduce that for total fertility rate for a country and slow population growth down, the best way to do it, the most effective way to do that, is to make sure that young girls are educated just like young boys. And you want to make sure that females have access to health care. Because the better cared for a child is, the less likely you are to have as many of them. And the last thing we need to talk about is the dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio is the number of people who are either too young or too old to work. And you compare that to the number of people who are productive, who are able to work. So usually if you're under 14 or over 65. And if you have a large dependency ratio, it really means that there's a greater financial burden on the working class. So it's an 85% dependency ratio in sub-Saharan Africa because they have lots of young people. It's a 47% dependency ratio in Europe, but in Europe it's opposite. In Europe and the US, we have a large elderly population. But either way, it places financial strain on the people who are working. So like Japan has a higher number of elderly people, more old people, right, than babies. They sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. So that dependency ratio can be when you have a high rate of old people or a high rate of young people. All right, that's it for tonight.